Hi guys, and welcome to the final lecture for Chapter 12 and Module 3. I hope you enjoyed Module 3 so far, and I really hope you enjoyed Chapter 12, although again, I know it can be a little bit depressing. But just a little bit of housekeeping. Remember that your exam is coming up, so if you haven't registered already, please register. Make sure you register on Register Blast far in advance. We don't want to see you guys have to lose your spot in the testing center because you didn't sign up quickly enough. So definitely make sure you sign up for your exam. And again, if you have any questions on any of the Chapter 12 material or Chapter 11 or 9 material, feel free to email me. I'm happy to go over it with you. And again, make sure you read and watch your study guides. Make sure that you feel like you are the most prepared you possibly can for the exam 3. Anyway, so going into our last lecture for Chapter 12, we're going to be talking about overharvesting and overfishing. So basically, overfishing is where we are actually removing fish faster than they can be reproduced. Basically, more than half of the world's marine fish populations are what are called fully exploited. Fully exploited fisheries refer to fisheries or a fish population that we cannot take more fish from that population without causing them to decline. So we are taking as many fish as we can from that fishery or from that fish population. And if we take any more, the fish will begin to decline. So this is basically the maximum sustainable yield of a fish population. Note that whenever we are using a fish population here, we are referring to all global populations of a given fish species, not necessarily a single population. We're now looking at a metapopulation just for simplicity's sake. So just think of all individuals of a species globally, not just one population in a given area. Now, more than a quarter of the world's fish populations are actually what are called overexploited. And this is where we get into overfishing. An overexploited fishery or an overfished fishery is basically a fish population that is decreasing in size because we are removing more fish from that population than can be actually reproduced. This is removing fish faster than they can reproduce, and continued overexploitation of a fishery will cause that species to go extinct. So overfishing can mean the loss of a fish species, and a loss of a fish species, it means a loss of the functional redundancy in that marine ecosystem. Recall from Chapter 8 and that ecosystem Jenga tower. Basically, every time we remove a species from an ecosystem, that ecosystem loses the functional redundancy of the niche that that organism was filling. So normally that's going to be a carnivorous and predatory fish. And so every time you pull out that fish or you remove a species from that ecosystem, it makes that ecosystem more vulnerable to collapse. Basically, it decreases the ecosystem stability, you lose productivity, and you lose the ecosystem service that fish provided. Basically, this is the provisional service of that fish species meat for sale. So to prevent a collapse of the world's fish species, we need to find more sustainable ways to harvest marine fish. We're going to go into aquaculture, where that can be used in some situations here in just a little bit. So when we talk about industrialized fishing often facilitates overharvesting because it basically is fishing on a massive scale. And now there are 5 basic types of industrial fishing methods. I think your book talks about 4 of them, but there is a 5th. Although the gill nets and gill nets and drift nets are very similar, so I think that they removed gill nets just because they are basically 2 sides of the same coin. One is floating, one is on the bottom. So bottom trawling is essentially where you have this enormous net and a boat is pulling it, and as it pulls it, fish get caught in the net, you haul up the net, and you take everything out of that net. For gill nets, basically that is a net that is submerged on the bottom of the floor, and as fish try to swim through that net, it's very, very hard to see, and as fish swim through that net, they get caught right around their gills, and so eventually, once you have enough of them, you kind of pull it up, take all the fish out of it, and you sell those fish. Purse seining is a very effective way to get schools of fish. Essentially, you lay out this enormous this enormous seine net, and then once you have enclosed all of the fish in a giant circle, you pull it up all at once and you get all of the fish in that school. Drift nets, going back to gill nets, they are basically two sides of the same coin. Whereas gill nets are on the bottom of the ocean, drift nets are drifting in the pelagic zone. So the same principle, fish will try to swim through them, they'll get caught right around their gills, and eventually you pull up the drift net and you get all the fish out of it. And then finally, long lining is basically industrialized line fishing. Basically, you have a long line pulled out behind the boat that has numerous different hooks. It's essentially industrialized trolling. And so eventually, as you get more and more fish hooking themselves on that long line, you eventually pull them all up, you take them off the lines, and you sell them. So what these all have in common is they produce and they capture fish on a massive scale. And when they do that, they have a bunch of different problems with catching too many fish at once, having problems associated with bycatch, and having problems associated with net pollution when they actually cut and release these nets, because a lot of these fishermen are not really environmentally conscious. So some of the problems associated with industrial fishing are that old nets, once they cut nets and release them, they continue to ensnare wildlife and kill wildlife. Basically, so whenever, actually, when we talk about plastic pollution, about 48% of the plastic pollution in the ocean right now is actually old net and fishing line. So this is a huge problem because they will continue to do their job. Basically, fishing net will continue to ensnare wildlife. Once they're ensnared, they can't move around, and eventually they will starve and die, and so that's a huge problem. In addition, most of those industrialized fishing methods will catch bycatch. Bycatch are basically non-target species, so basically like this seal that you see that was basically a target of bycatch. These fishermen were trolling for something. They were not trying to catch seal because seal is illegal to catch, and so instead of getting the fish they wanted, they accidentally caught a seal, and as a result of dragging it underwater, the seal ran out of breath because it's a mammal, and it eventually suffocated and died. In addition, industrialized fishing is almost too good at its job. They pull out too many fish, and this can result in overexploited fisheries, which can quickly collapse under intense harvest. A great case study is actually the collapse of Atlantic cod. Basically, cod was a staple in northeastern diets and sold like hotcakes. It was a very, very lucrative fishery, and even though the fish populations were declining very steadily over time, because we were getting more and more efficient at exploiting the fish, basically at capturing them via all of the industrialized fishing methods that we just talked about, we didn't really see the problems. We were catching just as many or more fish, even though we were pulling them out at a rate that was faster than they could be replaced. Finally, all of a sudden, there was this enormous collapse. Essentially, even though we were getting better and better at pulling these fish out of the water, there were no fish left. And so basically the fish population and the fish catch fell off a cliff, and all of a sudden that fishery is completely collapsed and gone. Since then, there have been some Atlantic cod spotted in the Atlantic Ocean. However, that fishery is basically collapsed, and it will take decades for that fish species to be able to come back, if it ever comes back at all. So now that we've talked about some of the problems associated with overfishing, we're going to talk a little bit about the solutions. Basically, aquaculture is the #1 solution to overfishing. Basically, this is rearing aquatic animals for the cultivation of, aquatic plants for food. So basically, we are farming fish or we are farming aquatic plants. Usually that's going to be algae. And this is going to be on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You see these rings, ring-shaped structures. Those are basically cages. So basically it's fish farming, and when we are farming the fish, we aren't removing them from the wild, and so we are preserving the native numbers of fish species without actually damaging their numbers. Now, there are some serious problems associated with aquifer, namely there's a lot of pollution and a lot of disease associated with the fish that were raised in cages, but nothing's perfect. The aquaculture methods continue to be refined, and they're getting better and better and better, namely with the advent of polyculture. Basically, when we are raising different types of aquatic vegetation in concert with shellfish and different types of fish species. So there are problems associated with aquaculture, but it continues to be the best solution that we have at this moment. In addition, marine reserves protect species and protect fisheries. Typically, what we're going to think of here are called marine protected areas, which protect areas of seas, oceans, as well as estuaries, and in some cases lakes that are large enough. Basically, these marine protected areas can come in many forms, ranging from wildlife refuges to research facilities, and essentially what they all have in common is that they restrict human activity for a conservation purpose. Basically, they keep people out of it. And so whereas in the unprotected area, often these fish species can be locally extirpated or fished out of that area, in the protected area, the fish have a sort of refuge, and so they have a way to build back their numbers. And then finally, public policy and consumer choices do a very good job in reducing fishing pressure. Basically, one of my favorite quotes is that every dollar you spend is a vote for the world you want to live in. So consumer choices, choosing to get farmed fish, even though they might have some health problems associated with them, or choosing fish that are not vulnerable. For example, tuna is, although tuna is delicious, I'll be the first to admit it, tuna is in some serious trouble. Tuna is one of the most overfished fishing species or fishing genera in the entire ocean. Very, very soon we are going to run out of tuna because we are removing them so quickly that they are not able to recover their numbers, and they are slowly collapsing. And so by not choosing to eat fish like tuna and instead eating fish that are far more in far higher numbers, you can cast your vote for the type of world you want to live in and reduce fishing pressure on these exploited fisheries. In addition, public policy. So in California, for example, they were removing certain types of nets from the water that had a high rates of bycatch. So again, public policy can go a very long way in reducing some of the pressures of overfishing. So that is everything from chapter 12. Again, please go and study all the previous lectures. Exam 3 is a toughie. Go through and look for the study your study guides and look at all of the different essay questions. And as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, feel free to call me, set up a appointment where we can talk. No worries at all. I'm happy to clarify any ambiguities or explain anything that you might want to hear about more in depth. All right, I can't wait to talk to you guys about some of the different topics in Module 4. See you then.